Garrett Slade had killed over 3,000 feral hogs in his life. 12 years as a Navy SEAL taught him precision, patience, and how to end things cleanly. Another 8 years as a professional hog hunter in the Texas Hill Country taught him everything else: how sounders moved through brush, how boars bedded down in creek bottoms, how to read tracks and scat, and the subtle disturbances that meant pigs were close. He thought he'd seen every variation the species could produce: spotted hogs, black hogs, red hogs, runts that barely hit 50 pounds and monsters pushing 350. Domestic escapees with floppy ears and pure ferals with the lean, mean look of something that had never known a fence. But the boar he killed on the night of March 17th, 2022, was something different. He'd been running thermal operations on a ranch outside Fredericksburg, night hunting with a suppressed rifle, picking off pigs that were tearing up coastal Bermuda pastures the landowner had spent $40,000 reseeding. Standard contract work. Find the sounder, eliminate the sounder, collect the bounty, move on. The boar appeared at the edge of his thermal scope around 2:30 hours. Even through the green-white glow of infrared imaging, Slade could tell something was wrong with the proportions. The body was too long, the shoulders too massive, the head carried at an angle that suggested a neck built for combat rather than rooting. He put the crosshairs center mass and squeezed. The boar dropped, standard. What he found when he approached the body was anything but standard. The animal weighed 487 pounds, nearly 100 pounds heavier than the largest boar Slade had ever killed. But weight wasn't the anomaly. Feral hogs occasionally reached 500 pounds through genetic lottery and favorable conditions. The anomaly was everything else. The tusks curved upward and outward in a pattern Slade had only seen in photographs from Eastern European hunting lodges. They were ivory white, worn to razor edges, extending nearly 6 inches from the jaw. Typical Texas feral tusks grew forward and hooked slightly upward. These grew like scimitars, designed for slashing rather than gouging. The coat was wrong too. Instead of the coarse, sparse hair typical of Texas ferals, this boar was covered in a dense bristle that formed an almost mane-like ridge along the spine. The color was a deep charcoal gray, nearly black, with silver frosting around the muzzle that suggested age. And the face was what stayed with Slade long after the night ended. The snout was longer than domestic pig genetics typically produced. The brow ridge was pronounced, heavy, giving the skull a primitive appearance. Looking at the dead boar in the beam of his flashlight, Slade had a strange thought. This animal looked like something from a cave painting, something that belonged to another era, another continent. Something prehistoric. He photographed the carcass from multiple angles, loaded it into his truck, and drove it to a processing facility in Llano that handled wild game. The facility owner, a man who'd been butchering Texas hogs for 30 years, looked at the boar and said 4 words that opened a door Slade would spend the next 2 years walking through. "That ain't from here." Slade sent tissue samples to 3 different labs. The first was a standard agricultural testing facility that handled livestock genetics for ranchers throughout central Texas. The second was a wildlife biology lab at Texas A&M. The third was a private genetics company in San Antonio that specialized in exotic species identification. All 3 returned the same result. The boar's DNA showed markers consistent with Sus scrofa, the wild boar species native to Eurasia, not domestic pig ancestry, not the typical American feral hog mixture of escaped farm stock and Spanish colonial pigs. Pure Eurasian wild boar genetics, comprising approximately 60% of the animal's total genomic profile. The remaining 40% was a mixture, domestic pig heritage, probably dating back several generations, and traces of what the A&M lab described as legacy feral population consistent with Gulf Coast origin. In simple terms, this animal was mostly Russian, and it had been born in Texas. The genetics didn't lie. The boar wasn't an import, wasn't an escapee from some exotic animal facility. Isotope analysis of its teeth confirmed it had spent its entire life within a 100-mile radius of where Slade killed it. It had eaten Texas vegetation, drunk Texas water, grown to monstrous size on Texas terrain. But its bloodline came from somewhere else. Someone, at some point, had brought Eurasian wild boar genetics into the Texas feral population. The question was who, and when, and why. Slade started asking questions. What he found was a conspiracy of silence that stretched back nearly a century, and a truth that explained why Texas was losing a war it didn't even know it was fighting. Texas has a hog problem. TH. That statement is so obvious, so frequently repeated, that it has become background noise, a fact of life that Texans accept the way they accept summer heat and property taxes. Feral hogs cause over $500 million in agricultural damage annually. They destroy crops, compete with native wildlife, spread disease, and reproduce at rates that make control efforts feel futile. Current population estimates range from 2 million to 4 million animals. Nobody knows the exact number because counting feral hogs is like counting roaches. By the time you see one, there are hundreds more in the walls. But here's what most people don't understand. This wasn't always the case. In 1980, the Texas feral hog population was estimated at approximately 500,000 animals. Significant, but manageable. Concentrated primarily in the eastern half of the state, in the dense brush and bottomland forests where Spanish colonial pigs had gone feral centuries earlier. By 2000, that number had tripled to 1.5 million. By 2010, it had doubled again to over 3 million. The expansion wasn't gradual, it was explosive, an acceleration that defied the normal patterns of wildlife population growth. Standard population dynamics would predict slower expansion, territorial pressure, resource competition, disease limitation, predation. Feral hogs had always been present in Texas. Why did they suddenly start multiplying at rates that outpaced every control effort? Wildlife biologists offered several explanations. Climate patterns that produced mild winters and abundant mast crops, expanded agricultural irrigation that created year-round food sources, the decline of large predators like mountain lions and wolves that might otherwise suppress pig numbers. All of these factors contributed, but none of them explained the change in the animals themselves. Because the hogs weren't just multiplying faster, they were getting bigger. Historical records from Texas wildlife management programs documented average adult feral hog weights through the 20th century. In the 1950s, the average adult boar in Texas weighed between 150 and 180 pounds. Sows averaged 120 to 150. Animals exceeding 300 pounds were exceptional, rare enough to make local newspapers. By 2020, those averages had shifted dramatically. Adult boars now routinely exceeded 200 pounds, with 300-pound animals common enough that hunters barely remarked on them. The state record, a boar killed in Conroe in 2015, weighed 790 pounds. Simultaneously, reproductive rates appeared to be accelerating. Historical studies suggested feral sows produced 1 to 2 litters annually, with average litter sizes of 4 to 6 piglets. Modern populations showed sows producing 2 to 3 litters per year, with average litter sizes approaching 8 to 10. Bigger animals, more offspring, faster maturation. The hogs were evolving in real time. Or more accurately, they were expressing genetics that hadn't been present in the population before. Garrett Slade wasn't a biologist, but he was a professional who took his work seriously, and the DNA results from the Fredericksburg boar bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate. He started with the obvious question: where did Eurasian wild boar come from? The species isn't native to North America. Sus scrofa evolved across Europe and Asia, from Portugal to Siberia, from Scandinavia to Indonesia. It's the ancestor of domestic pigs, the original wild stock that humans began domesticating roughly 10,000 years ago. European wild boar are different from feral domestic pigs in important ways. They're larger on average, with adult males regularly exceeding 400 pounds in good habitat. They mature faster and reproduce more prolifically. They're more aggressive, more intelligent, and more adaptable to harsh conditions. And they have those tusks, the curved, slashing weapons that European hunters have respected and feared for centuries. If Eurasian genetics had entered the Texas feral population, it would explain the changes wildlife managers were documenting. Bigger bodies, faster breeding, enhanced survival rates. Not evolution in the Darwinian sense, natural selection operating over generations. Something faster. Artificial introduction of superior genetics into an existing population. Someone had upgraded the hogs. The question was who? Slade started his investigation the way any SEAL would approach a target analysis. Gather intelligence, identify patterns, develop leads. He pulled historical records from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. He searched newspaper archives from the 1920s through the 1960s. He contacted hunting outfitters, ranch managers, wildlife biologists, and old-timers who remembered the way things used to be. What emerged was a story that had been hiding in plain sight for almost a century. A story of wealthy men, exotic ambitions, and a catastrophic miscalculation that was still unfolding today. The first documented import of Eurasian wild boar to Texas occurred in 1931. A German immigrant named Leopold Hartmann had made a fortune in cattle and oil during the boom years of the 1920s. He'd purchased a 15,000-acre ranch in the hill country and transformed it into a private hunting preserve modeled on the European estates he remembered from his childhood. Hartmann wanted to hunt the way his grandfather had hunted, on horseback, with dogs pursuing wild boar through ancient forests. The fact that Texas had no wild boar didn't deter him. He simply imported them. The records are fragmentary, but shipping manifests from the port of Galveston show that Hartmann received at least 3 shipments of live animals from Germany between 1931 and 1936. The manifests describe the cargo as livestock, sus scrofa, for private agricultural use. Hartmann released these animals on his fenced ranch. For nearly a decade, he hunted them in the European style, hosting wealthy friends from across the country for boar hunts that combined old-world tradition with Texas hospitality. Then came World War II. Hartmann died in 1943, natural causes, not the war, and his estate fell into legal dispute among distant relatives. The ranch changed hands multiple times over the following decades. The fencing deteriorated, and the boar, left unmanaged, did what wild animals do. They escaped. By the 1950s, sightings of unusual-looking hogs were being reported throughout the hill country. Animals with the distinctive Eurasian tusk pattern, the dense bristle coats, the aggressive temperament that differed from typical Texas ferals. Hunters and ranchers noticed, but didn't understand the significance. The escaped Hartmann boar bred with existing feral populations. Their genetics dispersed across the landscape, diluted by crossing with domestic origin pigs, but never disappearing entirely. And Hartmann wasn't alone. Slade found records of at least 11 other exotic imports between 1930 and 1970. Wealthy landowners in the Rio Grande Valley, the Trans-Pecos, the piney woods of East Texas. Each thought they were creating a private hunting paradise. Each lost control of their animals eventually through escaped stock, failed fencing, or simple neglect. By 1970, Eurasian wild boar genetics had been introduced to feral populations across at least 6 distinct regions of Texas. But the story didn't end there. Because while the wealthy importers of the 1930s and 1940s had acted individually, motivated by personal recreation, a more organized effort emerged in the decades that followed. An effort that was deliberate, coordinated, and driven by something far more powerful than nostalgia: money. The Texas exotic hunting industry generates over $2 billion annually. That figure includes everything from African antelope to Asian deer to European mouflon sheep, species imported legally under agricultural exemptions, bred on high-fenced ranches, and sold to hunters willing to pay premium prices for trophy animals. But hidden within that legitimate industry is a shadow trade that nobody wants to acknowledge. Trophy hog hunting. The market emerged in the 1980s as feral hog populations began their explosive growth. Hunting outfitters realized that clients would pay significant money, $500, $1,000, sometimes more, for the opportunity to kill a truly massive boar. The kind of animal with trophy tusks, the kind that made impressive photographs, the kind that justified taxidermy and bragging rights. The problem was supply. Wild feral hogs are unpredictable. A client might book a hunt and encounter nothing but small sows and juvenile animals. The trophy boars, the 300-plus-pound monsters with impressive tusks, were rare, difficult to locate, and impossible to guarantee. Unless you bred them yourself. Slade discovered this part of the story through an unlikely source. A retired hunting ranch foreman named Wade Crenshaw, who had worked at 3 different operations in South Texas between 1985 and 2010. Crenshaw was dying of emphysema when Slade found him, living in a trailer outside Carrizo Springs, surviving on oxygen and regret. He agreed to talk because he had nothing left to lose, and because the secret had been eating at him for decades. "We called it the enhancement program," Crenshaw said in a recorded interview from August 2022. "Started around 87 or 88, best I remember. The owner brought in some Russians, live boar from a breeder in Pennsylvania who'd been importing European stock for decades." Russians was the industry slang for Eurasian wild boar. The terminology acknowledged what everyone knew but nobody admitted. These weren't Texas animals. They were foreign genetics, deliberately introduced to improve hunting stock. "We bred them with the biggest local sows we could trap," Crenshaw continued. "First-generation crosses were huge, 400-pound boars with tusks like you wouldn't believe. Mean as hell, too. Exactly what the clients wanted." The ranch kept the breeding program behind high fences, theoretically contained. Clients would pay. Why premium rates for guided hunts where success was virtually guaranteed? Because the animals had been bred for size and aggression, then released into hunting pastures where they couldn't escape. Theoretically. Fences fail, Crenshaw admitted. Hogs dig, storms knock down wire, and sometimes animals got released on purpose. We had neighboring ranches, competition, and if their hogs got bigger, their bookings increased. Some outfitters figured the solution was making everyone's hogs bigger. They released breeding stock intentionally. Some did. Others sold trap stock to competitors who didn't ask questions about where it came from. The genetics spread. That was the point. If everyone had trophy hogs, the whole region benefited. Property values went up. Hunting lease prices went up. Everyone made money. Everyone, except the people who had to deal with the consequences. Crenshaw laughed, then coughed for nearly a minute before continuing. Nobody thought about consequences. We were building a better product. Bigger hogs meant better hunts meant more money. Supply and demand. The fact that these animals were smarter, meaner, harder to kill, that was a feature, not a bug, made the hunts more exciting. And when they escaped, that was someone else's problem. The enhancement programs weren't limited to South Texas. Slade's investigation identified similar operations across the state. Ranches in the Edwards Plateau, the rolling plains, the cross timbers, the coastal prairies. Dozens of facilities, over multiple decades, all quietly introducing Eurasian genetics into local feral populations through deliberate breeding and inevitable escape. The scale was staggering. One geneticist Slade consulted, Dr. Julian Mercer at the University of Texas, estimated that by 2020, At least 40% of the feral hog population in Texas carried measurable Eurasian wild boar ancestry. Not pure European stock, but hybrid genetics that combine the worst characteristics of both populations. What you're looking at is something genuinely new, Dr. Mercer explained in a 2023 interview. Not a wild boar in the European sense, not a feral domestic pig in the American sense. A hybrid that didn't exist before humans created it. We call them super pigs informally, though that name unfortunately sounds like a comic book villain. The hybrids exhibited what geneticists call heterosis, hybrid vigor. When two genetically distinct populations interbreed, the offspring sometimes exceed both parents in specific traits. The Eurasian domestic crosses were bigger than pure Eurasian boar and bigger than pure domestic ferals. They reproduced faster than either parent population. They showed enhanced cold tolerance, disease resistance, and environmental adaptability. We essentially created a perfect invasive species, Dr. Mercer admitted. Not through genetic engineering or laboratory manipulation, just through careless breeding and economic incentive. The ranches wanted trophy hogs. They got them. And now those genetics are everywhere, in every feral population in the state, spreading faster than we can track. Can it be reversed? Genetically, no. The genes are in the population now. They'll persist indefinitely, probably spread further as Texas hogs expand into neighboring states. You can't unring this bell. What about population control? Dr. Mercer's expression shifted, something between frustration and despair. I'll give you the math. To stabilize a feral hog population, not reduce it, just hold it steady, you need to remove approximately 70% of the animals annually. 70%. Every year, indefinitely. What's the current removal rate? Texas kills roughly 750,000 hogs per year through all methods combined. Hunting, trapping, aerial gunning, everything. That sounds like a lot. It's approximately 30% of the estimated population, maybe less. So we're losing. We're not just losing, we're falling further behind every year. The population grows faster than we can kill it. And now, with the hybrid genetics producing bigger animals that mature faster and reproduce more prolifically, the gap is widening. What's the end game? Dr. Mercer didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was flat, clinical, the tone of someone describing something he'd accepted but couldn't fix. There is no endgame. This is the new normal. Feral hogs in Texas, increasingly hybrid, increasingly dominant, until they've consumed every available resource and reached some kind of ecological carrying capacity. The damage between now and then, to agriculture, to native wildlife, to ecosystems, will be measured in billions of dollars and decades of recovery. And the ranches that started this, still operating, still breeding, still making money, because trophy hunting is still profitable and accountability in this industry is essentially non-existent. Garrett Slade spent 18 months investigating the origins of the Fredericksburg boar. He traced the genetic lineage through historical records, industry contacts, and DNA analysis. He identified the likely source population, a ranch in Uvalde County that had maintained a Eurasian breeding program from 1991 to 2008, when the operation was sold and the remaining animals were released or escaped. He documented the spread pattern, the introduction points, the decades of deliberate enhancement that had transformed Texas feral hogs from a manageable nuisance into an unstoppable invasion. And he came to understand something that changed how he saw his own work. He wasn't a hog hunter. He was a soldier in a war that had already been lost. When I was in the teams, we had a concept called mission failure, Slade explained in a recorded reflection from late 2023. It's what happens when the objective becomes impossible. Not difficult, impossible. When the math says you can't win, no matter how skilled you are or how hard you fight. That's where we are with hogs. The math says we can't win. We'd need to kill 70% annually just to hold the line. We're killing 30. Every year we fall further behind. Every year the hybrids spread further, reproduce faster, cause more damage. But here's what I learned in the teams about mission failure. You don't quit. You adapt. You find objectives you can achieve, even if you can't achieve the primary goal. You protect what can be protected. You save who can be saved. Slade's approach to hunting changed after his investigation. He stopped taking contracts from landowners who just wanted dead hogs. Instead, he focused on strategic removal, targeting breeding sows rather than trophy boars, working with wildlife managers to identify critical populations that could be reduced before they established in new territory. He also started talking to journalists, to researchers, to wildlife agencies, to anyone who would listen, not because he thought he could reverse what had happened, but because he believed people deserved to know the truth. The hunting ranches don't want this story told, Slade said. The exotic wildlife industry doesn't want this story told. Hell, the state agencies don't really want it told either, because it makes them look complicit, and they were, through negligence if not intent. But the truth is simple. Wealthy people wanted bigger trophies. They imported genetics that didn't belong here. They lost control of their experiments. And now Texas, and increasingly Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, and beyond, is paying the price. We built this monster. Every giant boar I kill, every hybrid with those Russian tusks, is the result of decisions made by men who are probably dead now, who made their money and left the consequences for the rest of us. That makes me angry, but anger doesn't change the math. So I keep hunting, not because I think I'll win, because someone has to hold the line. Someone has to go out every night and kill the things that are destroying this land. Someone has to fight the war, even knowing how it ends. That's what SEALs do. We fight, even when it's hopeless, especially when it's hopeless. Because giving up isn't in the programming. The investigation Slade conducted revealed a shadow history that implicates an entire industry. But the question remains, is anyone accountable? The ranches that ran enhancement programs operated in legal gray zones. Importing live wild boar requires permits, but enforcement was sporadic at best. Breeding programs on private land were essentially unregulated, and the release of animals, intentional or otherwise, was rarely documented or penalized. The statute of limitations has expired on most violations. The landowners who started the earliest programs are dead. The economic incentives that drove enhancement continue today, with new operations breeding ever larger hogs for an ever-hungry trophy market. And the hogs themselves keep spreading into new counties, new states, new ecosystems, carrying the genetics that were introduced decades ago, expressing them in animals that are bigger, meaner, and more prolific than anything Texas has faced before. The story of the super pigs isn't over. It's just beginning. The enhancement programs didn't stop in 2008. That was the uncomfortable truth Garrett Slade discovered when he started confronting the industry directly, not through historical records or retired employees, but through the men currently running operations. His first direct encounter came in March 2023 at a hunting expo in San Antonio. The event drew outfitters from across Texas and beyond, showcasing everything from whitetail operations to African safari packages. Slade attended not as a hunter, but as an investigator, carrying a digital recorder and a list of questions. The booth for Lone Star Trophy Ranch occupied prime real estate near the entrance. Glossy photographs showed massive boars, 400-pounders with tusks that curved like scimitars, the disty. Encetive Eurasian profile unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The tagline on their banner read, "Monster Hogs, Guaranteed." Slade approached the booth and introduced himself as a fellow professional. He mentioned the Fredericksburg boar, described its unusual characteristics, and asked a simple question. Where did genetics like that come from? The man behind the booth, later identified as ranch manager Dwayne Hutchins, smiled and deflected with practiced ease. Good breeding and good feed. Texas grows everything bigger, including Russian genetics. The smile disappeared. Hutchins glanced around, checking who might be listening, then leaned closer. I don't know what you're fishing for, friend, but I'd suggest you find another pond. We run a legal operation. Licensed, inspected, everything above board. Licensed to breed Eurasian wild boar. Licensed to breed exotic species for commercial hunting. What species, specifically, is our business? And when those species escape, your fences. Hutchins' expression hardened. Our fences don't fail. 8-foot steel mesh, concrete footings, regular maintenance. We run a professional operation. Then how do you explain hybrid genetics showing up in feral populations 100 miles from any licensed facility? I don't explain anything to anyone I don't know, and this conversation is over. Slade was escorted away by Expo security minutes later, but the encounter confirmed what his research had suggested. The enhancement industry wasn't historical, it was ongoing, and the people running it knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what the consequences were. They just didn't care. The legal framework surrounding exotic animal breeding in Texas is deliberately permissive. The Texas Animal Health Commission regulates the importation of live wild boar under brucellosis and pseudorabies control protocols. Permits are required. Inspections occur. On paper, the system should prevent uncontrolled introduction of foreign genetics into feral populations. In practice, enforcement is sporadic at best. Slade obtained records through public information requests showing that between 2015 and 2022, the Animal Health Commission conducted an average of 12 inspections annually at exotic breeding facilities across the state. There are over 1,300 licensed exotic wildlife operations in Texas. At that inspection rate, a facility might see a state inspector once every century. The commission is understaffed and underfunded, explained Dr. Miranda Vasquez, a former state veterinarian who left the agency in 2019. We had maybe 6 field inspectors covering the entire state. Most of our work focused on cattle. That's where the political pressure comes from. Exotic operations were essentially self-regulating. Self-regulating meant that ranches reported their own inventory, documented their own biosecurity measures, and investigated their own escape incidents. The state accepted these self-reports with minimal verification. We knew there was interbreeding happening, Dr. Vasquez admitted. You can't run a wild boar operation for 20 years without some animals getting out. Fences fail. Gates get left open. Sometimes animals dig under, sometimes they go through. It's inevitable. Did the commission take any action? What action could we take? The statute requires us to prevent the spread of specific diseases. It doesn't require us to prevent genetic contamination of feral populations. That's not our jurisdiction. Whose jurisdiction is it? Dr. Vasquez laughed without humor. That's the question, isn't it? Parks and Wildlife manages feral hog control, but they don't regulate exotic breeding. The Animal Health Commission regulates exotic breeding, but we don't manage feral populations. The Department of Agriculture handles crop damage, but they don't control wildlife. Everyone owns a piece of the problem. Nobody owns the whole thing. And while nobody owns it, the hogs keep breeding, the hybrids keep spreading, and the ranches keep operating because they haven't technically violated anyone's specific regulations. The bureaucratic fragmentation wasn't accidental, it was designed. The exotic wildlife industry had spent decades cultivating relationships with state legislators, contributing to campaigns, lobbying for regulatory frameworks that maximized business flexibility while minimizing oversight. The result was a system where billion-dollar industries operated with less scrutiny than a backyard chicken coop. Follow the money, Dr. Vasquez suggested. The exotic hunting industry generates over $2 billion annually. That's tax revenue, jobs, rural economic activity. Politicians love it. Nobody wants to be the one who regulates the golden goose, even if the golden goose is destroying the state's agriculture. Agricultural damage is diffuse, a little bit from each of a million landowners. The hunting industry is concentrated, a lot of money from a few who. Dread operators who know how to organize, how to donate, how to make phone calls. Guess which side wins? The answer was obvious, and it explained why, despite decades of evidence that enhancement programs were contaminating feral populations, no meaningful regulatory action had ever been taken. The monsters weren't just being built, they were being protected. In June 2023, Slade decided to stop gathering evidence and start demanding answers. His target was a ranch in Zavala County that multiple sources had identified as one of the largest enhancement operations in South Texas. The facility, operating under the name Hill Country Exotics despite being nowhere near the hill country, had been breeding Eurasian wild boar crosses since at least 1995. Former employees had described the operation in detail. Breeding pens holding pure Eurasian stock imported through intermediaries in Pennsylvania and Michigan. Crossing programs designed to produce maximum-size offspring. Trophy boars that regularly exceeded 500 pounds. And a history of inventory losses that conveniently coincided with the appearance of hybrid genetics in surrounding feral populations. The ranch was owned by a man named Curtis Drummond, a third-generation Texan whose family had made their money in oil before diversifying into exotic wildlife. Drummond had never granted an interview about his breeding operations. He didn't need to. The hunting clients who paid $2,500 for a guaranteed trophy boar weren't asking questions about genetic origins. Slade drove to the ranch on a Thursday morning, unannounced. The entrance was gated, monitored by cameras, protected by signs warning against trespassing. He pressed the intercom button and identified himself as a professional hog hunter interested in discussing industry practices. To his surprise, the gate opened. Drummond met him at the main lodge, a sprawling limestone structure that looked more like a resort than a working ranch. The man was in his 60s, silver-haired, dressed in pressed khakis and a custom-embroidered shirt. He looked like money that had never known a hard day. "Mr. Slade," Drummond said, extending a hand. "I know who you are. You've been asking questions about our industry for over a year now. I figured you'd show up eventually. You've been tracking me. I've been kept informed. Small community, exotic wildlife. Word gets around." He gestured toward a shaded patio. "Let's talk. I suspect you have opinions. I'd like to address them." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. Slade recorded it with Drummond's permission, though the rancher later disputed the context in which certain statements were made. The key exchange came about 90 minutes in. "You're breeding Eurasian wild boar," Slade said, "crossing them with domestic stock to produce hybrids, selling the results to hunters, and those genetics are ending up in feral populations across the state." "The first 2 statements are accurate," Drummond replied. "The third is speculation. Your own former employees describe escape incidents. Every livestock operation has occasional losses. We document them, report them as required, and take measures to prevent recurrence. And the hybrids showing up hundreds of miles from any licensed facility." Drummond smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I can't account for what other operations might be doing, or what might have happened decades ago before modern containment standards. What I can tell you is that my facility operates within all applicable regulations. Regulations that haven't been meaningfully enforced in 30 years. I don't write the regulations, I follow them, while making millions from an industry that's destroying Texas agriculture." Drummond's smile faded. "Let me tell you something about Texas agriculture, Mr. Slade. The ranchers crying about hog damage are the same ranchers who leased their land to hunting outfits for decades. They took the money when it was convenient. Now they want to blame someone else for the consequences. The consequences weren't predictable. Of course they were predictable. Everyone knew what would happen when you released wild boar into a landscape with no natural predators and unlimited food. Everyone knew the populations would explode. Everyone knew the animals would spread. Then why do it? Drummond leaned forward, his voice dropping. Because it was profitable. Because nobody stopped us. Because the people who could have prevented this, the regulators, the legislators, the agricultural interests, they all looked the other way because they were making money too. The ranchers leasing hunting rights, the outfitters booking clients, the hotels and restaurants and taxidermists and meat processors and everyone else in the supply chain. We're not the villains here, Mr. Slade. We're the ones who did what the system allowed, what the system encouraged. The fact that it turned into a disaster isn't our fault, it's everyone's fault, including the state that chose not to regulate us. That's your defense. Everyone was doing it. My defense is that I broke no laws, violated no regulations, and built a successful business, providing a service that customers wanted. If the system produced bad outcomes, fix the system. Don't blame the people who operated within it. The conversation ended shortly after. Slade left with a recording that documented Drummond's admissions and a clear understanding that the man felt no responsibility for the crisis he'd helped create. Accountability wasn't coming from the industry. It would have to come from somewhere else. The genetics don't respect state lines. By 2020, hybrid feral hogs carrying Eurasian wild boar ancestry had been documented in Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Missouri. By 2023, confirmed populations existed in Kansas, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. Wildlife agencies in states as far north as Michigan and Pennsylvania were reporting sightings, not established populations yet, but scouts, pioneers, the leading edge of an expansion that showed no signs of stopping. The northward spread represented something new, a test of whether the enhanced genetics would survive colder climates. Traditional feral hogs, descendants of domestic stock, were poorly adapted to harsh winters. Their coats were thin, their body fat reserves limited, their behavioral patterns suited to mild southern conditions. Cold weather killed them or pushed them south. The hybrids were different. Eurasian wild boar evolved across climates ranging from Mediterranean warmth to Siberian cold. They carry genes for dense winter coats, efficient fat storage, and behavioral adaptations to snow and ice. When those genetics crossed into American feral populations, they brought cold tolerance along with everything else. Dr. Ryan Kowalski, a wildlife biologist at Oklahoma State University, had been tracking the northward expansion since 2018. His research painted a disturbing picture. We're documenting winter survival rates in hybrid populations that exceed anything we've seen in pure domestic origin ferals, Dr. Kowalski explained. Animals that should die in a hard freeze are making it through. Animals that should move south are staying put, establishing year-round populations in areas that were previously too cold. How far north could they go? Based on the cold tolerance we're measuring, there's no biological barrier until you hit Canada. And even then, Eurasian wild boar range into Siberia. With enough time and selection pressure, there's no reason hybrid populations couldn't establish in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, anywhere with sufficient food and cover. The implications extended beyond simple range expansion. Northern agriculture, corn, soybeans, wheat, was already suffering billions in annual damage from existing wildlife. Adding feral hogs to that equation would multiply the losses exponentially. Hogs don't just eat crops, they destroy entire fields through rooting, trampling, and wallowing. A single sounder can devastate 50 acres in a single night. And northern ecosystems were even less prepared than Texas had been. The Midwest has no infrastructure for feral hog management, Dr. Kowalski noted. No professional hunting industry, no trap and remove programs, no aerial gunning operations. Texas has spent decades building response capacity, and it's still losing. What happens when hogs show up in Iowa or Illinois, in states that have never dealt with this problem? They'll be overwhelmed. They won't even understand what's happening at first. By the time they realize the scale of the invasion, the populations will be established, reproducing, spreading, and then they'll be facing the same impossible math Texas faces, needing to kill 70% annually while having the capacity for maybe 10. The monster wasn't just growing, it was metastasizing. The spread wasn't entirely natural. Slade's investigation uncovered evidence that some northern expansion was being deliberately accelerated by the same industry that had created the problem in the first place. Trophy hog hunting was no longer limited to Texas. Operations were opening across the South and increasingly in border states, offering clients the chance to kill massive boars without traveling to the traditional hotspots. These operations needed stock, and the fastest way to build a trophy hog population was to import animals with the right genetics. Documents obtained through whistleblower sources showed that live hog transport between states had increased dramatically between 2015 and 2022. Some of this transport was legal, licensed facilities moving animals for breeding or hunting purposes, but a significant portion appeared to be black market, unlicensed transfers that evaded inspection requirements. It's a shadow industry, explained former USDA Inspector Franklin Torres, who had spent 20 years monitoring livestock sport before retiring in 2020. Hogs moving in unmarked trailers, cash transactions, no paperwork. The animals show up at unlicensed facilities, get bred, and eventually escape or get released. Same pattern Texas saw 40 years ago, now repeating across the country. Why isn't anyone stopping it? Same reason nobody stopped it in Texas. Enforcement is expensive, the industry has political cover, and by the time the problem becomes visible, it's already too late. These things move faster than bureaucracies can respond. The people building the monsters had learned from their predecessors' mistakes. They'd gotten more sophisticated, more careful, harder to catch. But they were still doing the same thing, importing superior genetics, breeding enhanced animals, losing control of the results. And they were doing it in states that had no idea what was coming. Garrett Slade spent months trying to find a solution. He consulted with wildlife managers, population biologists, agricultural economists, and technology developers. He studied every approach that had been tried: hunting, trapping, aerial gunning, poison bait, fertility control, bounty systems, trained dogs. He looked for the innovation that might change the equation, the breakthrough that could turn an unwinnable war into something manageable. He didn't find one. The math is brutal and it's inescapable, explained Dr. Antonia Reyes, a population dynamics specialist at Texas A&M who had spent her career modeling feral hog expansion. I'll walk you through it, but I want you to understand up front, there's no trick, no clever solution that changes the fundamental reality. Dr. Reyes pulled up a presentation she'd given to wildlife managers across the Southwest. The first slide showed a simple equation. Feral hogs reach sexual maturity at 6 to 8 months, she began. Females can produce 2 to 3 litters per year, with average litter sizes of 6 to 10 piglets. Under optimal conditions, a single sow can be responsible for 1,000 descendants within 5 years. The hybrid genetics make this worse. Larger litters, faster maturation, higher piglet survival rates. We're seeing sows producing their first litter at 5 months, sometimes younger. The reproductive machinery is running at maximum speed. The second slide showed removal statistics. Texas kills roughly 750,000 hogs annually through all methods combined. That sounds like a lot. It's approximately 30% of the estimated population, maybe less, since we're probably undercounting the actual population. To stabilize, not reduce, just stabilize, you need to remove 70% annually. That's the threshold where removal matches reproduction. Below that threshold, the population grows. Above it, the population shrinks. The gap between where we are and where we need to be is approximately 40 percentage points. To close that gap, we'd need to more than double our current kill rate every year, indefinitely. The third slide showed cost projections. Current annual spending on feral hog management in Texas is approximately $50 million, federal, state, and private combined. To achieve 70% removal, our model suggests spending would need to increase to $500 million annually. And that's assuming efficiency gains from scaled operations. Could be higher. Where does that money come from? The state budget is already stretched. Federal agriculture disaster funds are allocated to acute events, not chronic management. The hunting industry, which profits from the problem, has no incentive to fund its own elimination. Even if we found the money, we'd face logistical constraints. There aren't enough trained hunters, enough helicopters, enough processing capacity. Scaling up to 70% removal would require building an entirely new infrastructure from scratch. That takes years. Years during which the population continues growing, making the target even harder to hit. The final slide was a single line of text. We cannot remove our way out of this problem. Dr. Reyes let the silence hold for a moment before continuing. That's the reality. I wish I had better news. I've spent 15 years looking for alternatives, fertility control, genetic modification, targeted pathogens. None of them are ready for deployment. None of them would work at scale even if they were. The population is too large, too dispersed, too reproductively robust. So what do? We manage, we prioritize, we protect the most vulnerable areas and accept losses elsewhere. We fund research that might produce breakthrough solutions in 10 or 20 years, and we stop pretending that current approaches are working because they're not. That sounds like surrender. It sounds like reality. The war was lost before most of us knew it was being fought. What we're doing now isn't winning, it's damage control. The question isn't whether the hogs will spread, it's how much they'll destroy before reach some kind of equilibrium with the landscape. And the people who created this, the ranches that bred the monsters. Dr. Reyes shrugged, a gesture of exhaustion rather than indifference. They made their money. They're still making their money. And they'll continue making money until someone decides that accountability matters more than protecting a profitable industry. I wouldn't hold my breath. The mathematics of population dynamics don't care about human determination. Neither does the sun care whether you want it to rise. Garrett Slade understood the numbers. He'd spent 2 years learning them, internalizing them, accepting what they meant. The war against feral hogs in Texas was unwinnable. The hybrid genetics would continue spreading. The agricultural damage would continue mounting. The monster his investigation had traced to its origins would continue growing until it consumed everything in its path. He kept hunting anyway. Not because he believed he could win, not because he thought his efforts would reverse the invasion, but because giving up wasn't something he knew how to do. In the teams, we had a concept called continuing mission, Slade explained in a recorded reflection from January 2024. When the primary objective becomes impossible, you don't stop operating. You adapt. You find secondary objectives that can still be achieved. You protect what can be protected. You save what can be saved. I can't eliminate the feral hog population in Texas. Nobody can. But I can reduce the pressure on specific properties, specific ecosystems, specific communities. Every hog I kill is one less hog destroying someone's livelihood. Every sounder I eliminate is one less breeding unit producing the next generation. It's not winning, but it's not nothing either. His approach had evolved since the investigation began. He no longer hunted for trophies or bounties. He worked with wildlife managers to identify critical areas, places where hog populations threatened endangered species, contaminated water supplies, or destroyed irreplaceable habitat. He prioritized breeding sows over trophy boars, understanding that removing reproductive females had more impact than removing impressive males. And he talked to anyone who would listen. He gave presentations at agricultural conferences, wildlife management workshops, hunting expos. He told the story of the Fredericksburg boar, traced the genetic history, explained how the monster had been built. He named the ranches, identified the patterns, documented the regulatory failures that had allowed it to happen. Some audiences were receptive. Others were hostile, representatives of the exotic hunting industry who saw him as a threat to their livelihood, politicians who didn't want to acknowledge problems they'd been paid to ignore. He'd been threatened with lawsuits, warned by anonymous callers, had his truck tires slashed in parking lots. He kept talking anyway. "The truth has a way of accumulating," Slade said. "You tell one person, they tell two more, the story spreads. Eventually, enough people know that the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. That's how change happens, not through a single revelation, but through the slow accumulation of awareness." Will it happen in time to save Texas agriculture? Probably not. The damage is already catastrophic and getting worse. But maybe, it happens in time to prevent the next state from making the same mistakes. Maybe Oklahoma or Louisiana or Arkansas learns from what happened here and actually regulates their exotic wildlife industry before it's too late. Maybe the monster stops growing before it consumes everything. That's what I'm fighting for. Not victory, damage control. A world that's slightly less destroyed than it would be if nobody fought at all. The night after completing his investigation, Slade went hunting. Not for a client, not for a bounty, just himself, alone in the Texas brush, doing the thing he'd done for 12 years. The thermal scope showed a sounder moving through mesquite about 400 yards out. 15, maybe 20 animals. Sows, juveniles, a few boars bringing up the rear. A breeding population doing what breeding populations do, eating, reproducing, expanding. He watched them for a while before raising his rifle. The lead sow was big, easily 250 pounds, probably carrying another litter. Behind her, 3 more sows of breeding age. Killing all 4 would eliminate significant reproductive capacity. Dozens of piglets that would never be born. A small dent in an infinite problem. He took a breath, settled the crosshairs, began the slow squeeze. Before the trigger broke, he paused. One of the boars had moved into profile. Even through thermal imaging, the outline was distinctive. The massive shoulders, the thick bristle ridge, the head carried high in the posture of an animal built for combat rather than rooting. European tusks, Eurasian genetics, the legacy of Leopold Hartmer. NN and Curtis, Drummond, and all the men who had built monsters for money. Slade shifted his aim, took the boar first. Then the sows, one by one, as the sounder scattered. When it was over, he sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the surviving pigs crashing through brush, fleeing to wherever they would regroup, reproduce, continue. Tomorrow there would be more. Next week, next month, next year. An endless supply of animals that reproduced faster than any effort could reduce them. A war without end, fought by men who knew they couldn't win but refused to stop fighting. Slade reloaded and started walking toward the next position. The math said he was wasting his time. He didn't care what the math said. The exotic hunting industry continues to operate. Ranches across Texas still breed Eurasian crosses, still sell trophy hunts, still contribute to the genetic contamination of feral populations. The regulatory framework remains unchanged. Underfunded enforcement, fragmented jurisdiction, political protection for profitable businesses. The hogs continue spreading. Into Oklahoma and Louisiana, into Arkansas and Missouri, into states that have never dealt with the problem and have no infrastructure to respond. The hybrid genetics that Texas ranches introduced decades ago are now Continental, dispersed across a landscape that offers unlimited food and no meaningful predation. Agricultural damage continues mounting. $500 million annually in Texas alone. billions more across the expanding range. Farmers and ranchers watch their livelihoods destroyed while the industry that created the problem counts its profits. Nobody has been held accountable. Nobody probably ever will be. But the story is told now, the origins documented, the connections mapped, the truth available to anyone willing to hear it. Garrett Slade still hunts. Every night he can, every property that needs him. Not because he believes he'll win, but because someone has to fight. Someone has to hold whatever line can be held, protect whatever can be protected, refuse to surrender even when surrender would be rational. That's what soldiers do when the war is lost. They keep fighting anyway. And somewhere in the Texas brush, the monsters keep breeding. Bigger, smarter, more prolific than anything nature would have produced. A man-made disaster spreading across a continent, the legacy of greed and negligence, and a system designed to protect profit over everything else. The feral hog apocalypse isn't coming. It's here. It's been here for decades. And now, finally, people are starting to understand who built it. What they do with that knowledge, whether they demand accountability, force regulatory change, or simply accept destruction as the price of doing business, will determine how much is left when the monster finally stops growing. Garrett Slade already knows what he'll do. The same thing he's always done. Fight, even knowing he can't win. Especially knowing he can't win. Because that's the only choice that means anything.